So, welcome to the Invicta Vita podcast. I'm really honored that I have Sarah Tucker here with me today. Thank you so much for being here, Sarah. It's
It's
an
my
honor.
pleasure.
It's a real honor to have you. And you've had such an interesting career. I mean, you've been a journalist, a broadcaster, an award winning writer, a novelist, a poet, and now you teach yoga to young people in schools. What inspired you, and how did you do so many different things in your life?
Well, I suppose yes, I am a bit of a polymath. And as I said, it's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Pleasure.
I really, even as a child, I was aware that I wanted to be a polymath, although I didn't know what it was called. I felt that having one job for life or identity for life just seemed odd to me. And I remember watching Saturday morning television and seeing programs like Tarzan and films like Alice in Wonderland. I read Alice in Wonderland and Robinson Crusoe, and I related not to the gender, sort of like Jane and Tarzan, but I related to the sense of adventure and autonomy and freedom and rigor. um, and consequently, I wanted a life, I suppose, where I was able to learn from different spheres. So initially, when I started out when I was at school, I got a scholarship to Loughborough University. I didn't get good enough grades to actually get into the scholarship, although I was accepted. And I initially went into the city, and I realized that I think the polite way of putting it, it didn't align with my personality. I'll put it that way. And from there, I took evening classes as a journalist. I worked on local radio, national radio, and really the different areas that I've worked in have been a result of not really applying in a very, sending my CV, but almost in a very, very random way, meeting people, networking with people outside a particular industry. And I know we're going to be talking about what women in finance, sort of like the recommendations that I would give them to do. And I think my ability to have a range of friends, and they're not just contacts, they're friends in completely different industries, has always it makes your life much more interesting. But it is interesting not to just have a set of friends and contacts within a particular sphere. And as a journalist, you're meeting loads of different people anyway, interviewing them, being interviewed as well. So that is incredibly interesting. I've been a travel journalist for about over 30 years now, both as a radio journalist, a television journalist, where perhaps what you say is far less important than how you look. So, and obviously, I've, the written word. And you mentioned about poetry. Poetry is something that I have always been interested in. And I've just realized that it is not just something that is enjoyable to do, but it is potentially a way of challenging your thinking. If you think in a very linear, binary way, it can really change your perspective and tap into areas you thought other pros could not reach, I suppose. As far as the yoga is concerned, well, just over 10 years ago, I used to practice yoga myself, and I wanted to improve my practice as a yoga, just as being able to do yoga, because I do so many things. I'm a novelist and a journalist and a broadcaster. Yoga is a really good way of clearing the mind, helping you to focus. And if you're juggling loads of different things all at the same time, as a lot of people are, especially women, um, it's a very, very good practice. And I qualified as an instructor really so I could up my game. But what happened is that once I qualified as an instructor, people were asking me, friends were asking me, could you teach me? So I started to teach. So I suppose I turned my hobby into a business. And then um, I was asked, it was actually a police schools liaison officer who asked me to teach some police cadets for free. So I said, fine, yes, okay, great. And I turned up and I was teaching all ages. I thought I'd be teaching sort of like 21, 22-year-olds, and I was teaching 11-year-olds as well. And so, and then he said, you're great with children. Would you like to teach in schools? So I ended up for a time teaching 3-year-olds up to 16-year-olds, and now which was a joy. You can imagine teaching a 3-year-old yoga. They're like little joy beings. They can get their feet behind their head sort of and do the splits, and but what I specialize in now, and I've been doing it for quite a few years, I specialize in teaching specific demographics. I teach teenagers, I teach adolescents, so the 13 to 14-year-olds in secondary schools. They are that's known as year nines, the adolescent years, which I believe parents and teachers find most challenging, and also that the children do as well. And that is incredibly rewarding. I also teach the teachers because they are incredibly giving. They need to be taught how to breathe, how to relax. And I find teaching those areas now the most rewarding. So I suppose you've asked one question and I've told you sort of a whole gamut of it, but really that's how I've always made my really not really consciously, but what has happened, things that I've enjoyed doing have somehow become a business. I enjoy travel. I'm a travel journalist. I enjoy yoga. I instruct yoga now. With poetry, I do performance poetry, and I always say to people when I go into schools and I do lectures, I talk about the whole concept of what success is, and people often think of it as purely the financial metric, how much you earn, but it's so much more to it than that.
Thank you. That's a really good summary. You've really turned your passions into your career and what you love, which I think is great. We've spoken before about the patriarchy and toxic work cultures. I just want to have your view on where those systems originate from and what can we do both individually and collectively to dismantle them.
I think that's an excellent question. I don't think it's answered enough and as coherently as that. Um, having experience working in the city and having been on a social level with that environment, I don't feel the system will change because the system makes money. And the people who are attracted to the system and to the structure of the system make money. So until you change the structure to so that it doesn't make money anymore, it's going to continue. Patriarchy is inherited. It's inherited generationally. I think behavior, whether it's consciously or unconsciously done, is inherited. So sons will inherit it from their fathers, mothers will have inherited it from their mothers. So it is very difficult to break. And because I was talking about the financial metric, because specifically in the financial industry, that is how a lot of people's identity is solely wrapped up in how much money they earn, especially at the front office level, less so at the back. They're a different sort of animal. So I think until they get paid more money for being collaborative and uh, uh, sort of like working with each other rather than purely on the financial metric, because that is how they operate, it will not change. And it's really from a woman going into the financial industry. And I've thought a lot about this before I came on here, how to describe it. It is, I wouldn't say, I think you go in with your eyes open. You there's a lot of programs like Industry, which sort of like almost glamorizes the cruelty and the brutality, and they're brutal. The men are all brutalized, whether it's through the public school system or what it is, but so are the women as well. The Wolf of Wall Street, I know when that came on, I was told that was more young men wanting to be city traders, which I thought, oh, really?
Yeah.
You know, so that the shine of money still punches through, and I feel that if you're a woman wanting to go into that world, it is a structure that is incredibly entrenched and incredibly well protected. So I almost feel as though there are the potential, but not the guarantee of financial rewards. But it is essentially possibly like going into an abusive relationship. I would say that you must always have everything documented. Some of the times, I remember once I went up to human resources to, you know, just not make a complaint, but just make a statement. I felt that I should be in another department because I wasn't right in that particular department. And before I'd got back to my department, they'd contacted my head of departments who knew all about it. And I was very polite about everybody. But I think understanding that human resources within a bank is there for the institution, it is not there for the individual.
That is so key. I just want to jump in right there because a lot of people get really shocked when I tell them HR told me not to speak up. I actually got asked to be quiet by a HR department. And people forget that HR departments in the finance industry, they're working for the bank. They're not working for you. They're not there to protect you. And that might seem controversial, but it's actually the truth.
No, it is basically the bank is a brand. They are there to make money. In fact, sort of like there's a lot of companies who are there to make money and they advertise themselves as caring and sharing, and even banks do. But at least banks are there to make money. They are not your friends. It's interesting. Even my sort of like former husband who worked in the city, he would say to me, "Sir, they are not your friends." And human resources, the if you like, the key is actually in the word resources. A resource is expendable, deployable. You are replaceable, and really, when you go to them and you tell them their story, it's a bit like you're speaking to the lawyer, the defense lawyer. Basically, you're speaking to their legal department. So keep your ink dry, and also always have. I would say, a lot of people say you'll have lots of contacts within the industry. I would say, back to what I said before, is that my strength has always been that I've had contacts in lots of different industries at a very high level. In fact, I remember once it happened 3 times in 1 week, and I became a little bit self-conscious about it. I had lunch with a variety of friends who were all very senior, one in the publishing world, one in advertising, and one in the travel industry. It must have been something else because I know quite a few people in the travel industry. And at the end of lunch, they were all telling me stories about the politics of their industry at very, very senior level. And at the end, they all looked at me and said, "Sarah, I can tell you this because you don't know anybody." And and I went away thinking, well, it sounds like Sarah no mates. And really what they were saying is that I'm not in competition with them. Nothing that I say will get back to them, and they are able to share, and we're able to cross-pollinate ideas without fear of it sort of like coming back to them at any time. And that's powerful. So I would say if a woman is going into the financial industry, first of all, make sure that it's the financial metric that is what they're interested in,
Mm.
because that is all that there is, really. There's other industries which are creative, where you are creating something. Some people say, oh, they're creating markets in the financial industry, or they're creating jobs. There's other things you can do where your, I suppose, intellectual property could be much better used. There's some incredibly bright people in the financial industry, and I actually think if they were entrepreneurs, ironically, they would make a lot more money
Mm.
and actually burn out far less quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Burnout's a really important one, and we don't talk about it enough. But actually, I know people who are in full burnout in their 20s, and you think, you're
Well,
so young.
well, before I started to specialize in teaching yoga to teenagers and teachers, I did teach in clubs. And I would have a lot of city people who would come in. I used to teach very early morning classes, 6:30 in the morning. I think some people used to turn up in their pajamas, or they looked as though they did anyway. And it was a lot of city people. And the club, one of the clubs I worked at, said, "Oh, can we start the yoga at 5?" Because a lot of city people start at 6, before 6. And I did, but I felt you will only be able to last so long. I can teach you how to breathe properly and relax, but a lot of the philosophies I am teaching you are totally the antithesis of the philosophy of the philosophies, or what you are learning is valuable in your work. So I don't know really how they balance it out. I think it was more to do with the fact that if they had insomnia, or if they were stressed, which they would be. And yoga has become over the years an incredibly trendy thing to do. So, a lot of people I know go on yoga retreats, which is okay, but it's a bit like going on people go into yoga and start to practice yoga almost as a doorway to other things. So I used to have, when I started to teach, I realized I needed a little black book, because people were coming up to me in tears at the end of it. And it wasn't because they'd stretched too much, or I'd made them touch their toes too much, or anything like that. It was because what yoga does, it opens you up. You're totally unaware of it. So it's like when you're moving, you're focusing on your breath work, not all the things that distract you. Something will trigger you, and something will come to the surface. So people were needing counselors, or psychiatrists, or psychoanalysts. They were needing people that the sort of thing that I could not help them with. And a lot of the city people needed that. And when they go in, everyone at work, especially in a corporate environment, is incredibly performative. They are not who they are at work, especially in the city. They put on a mask, they put on armor, especially city traders. And it's all very, bromance, but it's protection, it's a mask. The problem is that they use that, they can't switch off. They think they use alcohol and stuff to switch themselves off, but they go home and they're exactly the same with their partners and families. So they're trading all the time, and it's not a healthy environment.
Absolutely. I want to talk a bit about your poems. You very kindly shared some with me, and some of them really did strike a chord. You cover things such as city traders, misogyny, domestic abuse. What inspired you to write these poems?
I do lighter ones as well. Like my lovely Honda Jazz died about 3 weeks ago, and that car just took me places, supported me, and never let me down. And it really was a fabulous car. And I wrote a poem about it, really to say that it's a pity I can't have a relationship just like that. And I thought, no, I don't need that. I just need another Honda Jazz, But so I write funny poems as well. Poetry, really, it was when I was writing some pieces for the Times. I just returned back from Africa, and Africa was one of those continents that really, some of the trips I've done have been really quite special. And when I'm able to write the article, that's fine. The editor was very happy with it. But it touched me so much. I thought, I've got to write a poem. When it really gets to you under your skin, prose just doesn't do it. You've got to, poetry reaches places, as I said, other, it's like other structural narratives don't reach. It's an art form. It's the closest thing of art form. And one of the books which we haven't mentioned yet, one of the last books that I wrote was the biography of Edward de Bono, who invented the concept of lateral thinking. And he said poetry is an excellent way of it's a thinking tool. It gets you to think about things in a different way, use perspective and perception as a thinking tool rather than just something interesting to listen to. And consequently, I started to write it. Most children write poetry. When you think of children's books, a lot of the children's books are written in rhymes so that you can remember them. And I started to write poetry because I felt that when something really sort of was powerful to me, I wanted to express it in poetry form. The Times, the people I was writing for said, "Oh, I love the poem, but no, we can't publish it." So I thought, right, I will speak it. So I do performance poetry. And I've set up a company called the Boardroom Bard because I've had experience in the city and advertising and publishing and lots of, I suppose, different industries. I've realized that each industry has its own jargon. There's a lot of corporate ego. And so when I thought, right, I will produce bespoke poetry for companies. And so if they have an annual conference or there's a business conference, I can identify what the issues are. And using humor and mischief, I can help them think about the issues and the solutions rather than putting blame, but use humor and play in a very productive way. And it's worked extremely well. And it's very unexpected because a lot of the people sitting around the boardroom table were thinking about, when they think of poetry, they think of either Pam Ayres or W.H. Auden or Keats. And here I come writing about something that really resonates, so that's how I got involved with that. But I love poetry and I love performing it as well.
So speaking of performing, would you be happy to perform one of your poems with us?
I'll perform a little bit of it because the one is quite long, and I think sort of like if this one, I think resonated with you, so I'm going to read it.
Thank you.
I usually learn them off by heart, but this one, because I wrote it fairly recently for a particular charity. But anyway,
thank you.
It's called Lessons for Girls. She was trained young to be less loud, less sharp, less sure. Boys were fragile things, she was told, handle with praise. Men come unfinished, women are the instruction manual and the warranty. Misogyny wore a cardigan, smelt like advice, said expect little. This is wisdom. Said all marriages are theatre. And suffering is the ticket price, said endurance makes you good. So when her life felt like a shrinking room, she blamed the woman in it. Systems adore cooperation. Truth arrived sideways over coffee, wearing someone else's voice. A friend said something small, and then something smaller, and then stopped smiling. Oh, you too. The stories lined up like teeth, same phrases, same pauses, same men with different faces, same invisible leash. It is a terrible thing to recognize your life outside your body. What you excused becomes obvious. What you survived becomes named. Truth does not shout. It clicks.
Wow, that was really powerful. Thank you, Sarah. Do you want to say a few words about that?
I think I wrote it for a charity called Refuge, but there's a lot of charities that deal with domestic abuse, and over the years I've spoken to colleagues and friends who've suffered from domestic abuse, and again it's one of those things. It's written about a lot, but poetry poetry has the nuance, I think, sometimes, and it touches, hopefully the poetry touches people that way. As I said, I a lot of domestic abuse is it's not without bruises, it's words. And it's become normalized. So you think everything becomes very, very performative. And now when I meet couples, I'm aware, I see the signs and the signals. And it's a bit like that, what I said about, I think the line that most people go, ooh, it's a terrible thing to recognize your life outside your body when someone says things to you that are exactly what has happened or is happening in your life.
Yeah.
That's usually when it clicks. And as I said, truth does not shout, it clicks in your head. And that's when you go, okay, this is what it is. A lot of women, I know it's a really funny thing, but a lot of women don't know they've been raped until someone says, actually, that was rape.
Yeah.
And that happens a lot.
Yeah.
A lot, especially in my generation.
So where they haven't given consent, but
they haven't given consent and they just thought, where it's just been normalized.
Yeah.
That happens a lot.
Yeah, and I think we need to reframe the language and actually get women speaking about it. And I hear a lot of women who are from, generations older than mine saying, oh, but in the city in the 80s, this was normal. Well, a lot of things were normal 300 years ago. It doesn't mean we continue with those systems.
It was never right. Yeah. It was never right. And I think, we talk about the Jimmy Savile thing. It's amazing how many, even with the Andrew Mountbatten, Windsor and all the things going on, it's amazing how many women say, but, the women, they were, they put themselves forward. And I'm thinking, really? Really? And what it is, it's become normalized. But we're talking about the patriarchy.
Yeah.
You're talking about fathers passing that attitude down to their sons. It's their mothers as well, passing it down to their daughters. Yeah. The whole concept of being stoic, putting up with behavior, which is, you just think, no. Like I witness a lot of things now. And, and I see this and I'm thinking, I would not put up with that level of selfishness or narcissism or misogyny. And it's very, they're very, very clever, very, very, very charming. There's more of the poem if you like. I don't know whether you have a website, but I can sort of like put it on your website because there's a lot. I think unfortunately girls are trained to be silent from a very early age. They're taught very young to be less than. And I feel myself very lucky. I mentioned about the things that inspired my autonomy and sense of adventure. Your parents do a lot. My father taught me to be brave, to be courageous. He almost brought me up to be a boy in that sense, to be very courageous. I was always very curious, always asking lots and lots of questions, and very tenacious. I don't give up. But also that sense of adventure. My mother wanted me to be financially independent, which is great, but the lesson she had been taught from her mother, financial independence, was marrying someone. And that is actually the not financial independence. In fact, actually, it is completely the reverse. Financial independence is you make your own money by yourself for yourself. That's real financial independence. And the romance thing is lovely, it's like, but do not marry for financial independence. It does not work that way. It does not work that way.
It doesn't work that way. And I do think that scares some men, where now women are financially independent, so we don't need to marry them for their money. We actually can earn our own money, and therefore it's, well, what are you bringing to the relationship?
Well, this is it. This is it. I think that I don't think women still do not earn to the same a level, and also women are, although they can earn the money, they're very different creatures to men. Again, we were talking before the program that I've written fiction novels or fictionalized novels as well as non-fiction, biographies, and uh, I wrote a book called The Last Year of Being Single back in 2002, which did extremely well. And I remember men and women reading it, and they were reading it from very different perspectives. And women who read it were more sympathetic to the male characters than the men. And the men were able to read right through the male characters, and the women were going, oh, and the men were going, mm-mm. So I find that fascinating. I think we are harder on our own sex actually than we are on the opposite sex. It's a bit like when you get a group of men together and you have one woman, it changes the dynamic. It's exactly the same thing happens when you have loads of women together and you have one man, it changes the complete dynamic. Healthy to have a balance. And I think that the city will always be a boys' club, whatever they say, whatever it's, again, anything they say about diversification, about transparency, all the things that they say. No, I don't believe a word of it. Whether human resources say you can come to us, no, don't believe. Their metric is to make money. That is it. That is the value they have. That is it. That is where it stops and starts. And I feel as long as you know that, and I mentioned about it's going into it may be financially lucrative, but it will potentially be abusive. And actually, you can be an entrepreneur and you can earn a lot more money that way.
Absolutely. You've spent your life in journalism, but you've also been on the other side of the interview. I want to talk to you about how do you navigate the media and the press. We've spoken about the fact that sometimes certain words can be taken out of context, and that can be quite tricky to navigate. So what advice would you give to someone who's trying to navigate the media?
Again, that's a lovely question. I have been on both sides. I've been both the interviewer, and when I interview, I always do due diligence on the person I'm interviewing, find out as much about them. And also, my remit is always to make them feel incredibly comfortable so that they relax. As I said, I've worked in television and radio, and frequently, especially with radio, it's sort of you're always warming someone up beforehand so that when the mic is on, they will relax. Same with television. But I've always found that people who are incredibly chatty beforehand, as soon as the director says action, they will probably freeze, which can be so, you've got to be very good with open answers and yes, lots of noddies and things like that. On the other side, again, it's important to do due diligence on the journalist, not only on the journalist, but also on the publication or the program on which they are working, because you can say something. It's always better to do, if you're doing television or radio, it's always better to have it live, because if it's live, they can't edit sort of like things out. They can't turn your yes into a no. And if you have your whole story, they can't fill in the gaps. Frequently, if something comes out, especially if it's a written piece, and you ask to see what they've written, and it's even happened to me, a journalist sent me the interview and it was great, but the editor or the publisher, but it's usually the editor, will write the headline, and the headline can completely change what is said in the article. And frequently you can have a headline and then which says one thing, and you read the article and it's nothing like the headline. But editors are not interested. They're more interested in the amount of clicks, the attention, what is going to be seen, than they are in the nuance of an article. I think that is key. But I think always become a storyteller. If you can become a storyteller, then it makes the journalist's job so much easier. So I think if you're being interviewed by a journalist, do due diligence just like they would do due diligence on you. Um, have your sound bites, have things that it's usually three things that people you can say five amazing things, but usually they'll only remember three. And if you say 10 amazing things, they'll probably only remember two because you've said so many amazing things. But think of a soundbite, think of three things that you want them to remember, and keep it to that. Then it will go well and you'll actually enjoy the experience. But just be aware that the more you do, if you see a journalist's articles and the sort of things that they write tend to be very sarcastic or edgy or sort of like sensationalist. Like, in fact, in Edward de Bono, he was interesting. He said journalists are only interested in human angle, attack and gimmick. He had with some journalists, he had a very bad reputation simply because he would tell them, that is not a very good question. And you don't tell a journalist, that is not a very good question. I know I've said your questions are genuinely good, but you don't. So often some of the articles that came back he had some wonderful things written about him, but he also had some negative things written about him, which was a shame because I knew him for the last 10 years of his life and he was an amazing man.
Yeah. You touched a little bit on lateral thinking. What does that mean and how can we apply it to our lives?
Yeah, well, I meet a lot of people, and you see it a lot on television, and hear it a lot on radio and podcasts and things these days. People say, are you thinking out of the box and lateral thinking, but they don't really know what it is. And I mentor some Cambridge graduates, looking at their CVs, and it's frequently that they put on it, I'm a lateral thinker. And I remember one girl, absolutely brilliant. And I just finished Edward de Bono's biography, and I'd been researching his life and work on lateral thinking for over a decade. So I do know what lateral thinking is. And so I said to her, oh, you're a lateral thinker. So what is lateral thinking? And there was a sort of like a silence, and she said, well, it's thinking out of the box. And I said, well, what is thinking out of the box? And she said, well, it's thinking creatively. And I said, right, okay. That's interesting. One, always know when you put something down on your CV, knows what it means because it's actually in the dictionary. But lateral thinking is actually, it's almost like a scientific term. Our brain works in organizing patterning systems, self-organizing patterning systems, like all the other organs of the body. And lateral thinking is a change in that self-organizing patterning system. So it usually that happens when we've undergone some sort of trauma, bereavement, divorce, 9/11, something like that, World War, where our perception of what is important, what is invaluable, changes dramatically. That is good for our brain because it really makes us think and step out of our box, literally. But it's not good for our heart, or it's not good for sort of the other organs of the body, which also change their patterning systems. Trauma is not good for you. It's good for the brain, but it's actually because it's sort of so what it is, as I said, it's changing that self-organizing patterning system of the brain. It's a long-winded way of saying the process of coming up with ideas and solutions, which are brilliant. And so Edward invented the term, which is much easier to say, lateral thinking. And he, during spanning about 30, 40 decades, he became a global icon before the internet and before it became relatively easy to become a global icon. He introduced thinking classes into schools. He developed the 6 thinking hats, which was widely used in businesses. He wanted to introduce thinking classes into schools around the world, but it was actually business and commerce which took up the ideas because it made them money. The advertising industry adored him. People like Sir Paul Smith, the Eurythmics. There were lots of Richard Branson, lots of people who took up his ideas and worked with him, collaborated with him, and made a lot of money because of him. He wrote about 66 books. As I said, I knew him for the last 10 years of his life, and I cried when he died. I was sort of like he'd become mellow in his, died in his 80s, but he'd become very I think I should imagine when he was younger, his mind was going. He was Ferrari. His mind was going like a Ferrari, but he could hold an audience of 10-year-olds and 60-year-olds in his hand. The way he told stories, the way he spoke about different ideas, about coming up with solutions rather than focusing on brain, being right. There was a book he wrote in 1990 called I Am Right, You Are Wrong, which basically said that whole idea of critical thinking, of the whole thing about, he called them the three wise men, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, categorization, argument, and the seeking of truth. We are in such a muddle because we are now seeking truth, whereas truth is perception, truth is perspective. There is no such thing as absolute truth. So Plato is no use to us anymore. Categorization, Aristotle, everybody in their box. As I mentioned before, the whole idea of lateral thinking is that actually we shouldn't specialize. It's the connection between each industry where the gems of ideas come from. In fact, the person who wrote the foreword is Baroness Helena Kennedy, and she is an amazing woman. She is... when I interviewed her for something else, and she knew I was researching Edward de Bono's biography. And she said, she was a huge fan of his, that, his vision has yet to be really fully realized, because she says she is a much better litigator now because she's been on the board of the medical industry, publishing industry, engineering industry, lots of industries that have nothing to do with her particular area of speciality, and it's made her a better litigator. Her husband, give an example of what lateral thinking is. Her husband was, if they were going on holiday and he was reading an in-flight magazine, and he's a surgeon, and he was reading something about a plane engine, and how the new technology was helping the engine run more effectively. And he thought, we could use this in the surgery. We could use this. I wonder if we could use this. And he went back, and the same technology that was used for a plane engine could be used in some of the technology that is used to deal with sort of like brain surgery. And so that is an example of, you think it may not be relevant, but actually you realize the connection. And this is what I mean about collaboration. But with sort of like the other wise man, Socrates, where he said about argument, you can see in Parliament now, when you want to get anything done, actually there are incredibly, yes, there's huge egos, but they're very bright men and women. Actually, if they work together, rather than saying that they were conservative or Labour or Liberal or Green or whatever they are, it's all nonsense. Actually, if they all attempted to work together and find the solution, it would be actually much more effective. But they don't want to do that because we've been brought up to debate and argue. In Parliament, it's two swords away, and two swords width away. And this is what Edward would always say. Actually, politicians do not know how to think because their egos get in the way. They fall into the ego trap, and academics fall into the intelligence trap because they have their doctorates and they've researched everything to the nth degree. So they think they know it all. And when you know it all, when there's certainty, you stop learning, you stop questioning. Your curiosity is stopped. Teenagers now, there's a real decline in curiosity. And I think that is dangerous. I don't think that's just sad. I think that's dangerous because when we stop asking questions or we become fearful, that makes us much more easy to manipulate, and that is, and then we stop thinking. So and I learned this all from him, as you know, I learned from him, so I know a lot about lateral thinking.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I want to come back to your yoga. You're teaching yoga to young people in schools and clubs. So tell me a little bit, how did you start doing that? And then what have you seen in terms of these young people, in terms of their confidence and their well-being? How has yoga helped them?
Um, I um, I I started teaching because of that police. There was a police liaison officer who used to go into schools, and I think he got my details from the internet and asked me to teach the police cadets. And I taught some of the police cadets. I thought it was going to be sort of like police cadets in their 20s, but they were in their, they were 11, 12, 13, as much younger. And he was liaising with lots of different schools in the area. And he said, this woman is good. She's very good with children. And he had contacts with the head teachers. And so I went in, introduced myself. The schools had no money. So I said, that's fine. That's fine. And so I went in and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. My father was a deputy head. And I've taught dance and aerobics and in the past. So, I've lectured before. So I thought, great, I can teach the children. But obviously, how you teach a 3-year-old is very different to the way you teach a 7-year-old and 10-year-old and 15-year-old and 50-year-old. It's all very, very different dynamic. But it challenged me. I was out of my box as far as what I felt I could teach, and I had to what also teaching those younger age groups did to me. I had to become much more playful in the way I talked about things. I didn't make the tree pose stayed a tree pose. It didn't become a kangaroo pose, or anything sort of silly like that. It stayed true to the philosophy. And yoga, whatever yoga, whether it's Iyengar or Ashtanga or Yin yoga or Vinyasa, it's all about the breath, how to learn to breathe properly, how to calm yourself down, how to empower yourself, how to focus, how to let go of all the stuff that's projected on you during the week by your friends, your family, the media, your expectations, sort of the patriarchy, whatever. Just actually let it go, because it's not your voice. And I from doing that, I actually wrote a book, a yoga book for adults. I wrote a yoga book for teenagers called 14, FUOURTEEN, and for children as well, the brilliant book of balances, twists, terrific twists, super stretches, excellent energies. So it made me as a writer think about how to engage all the different age groups in yoga. Obviously, 3-year-olds are incredibly flexible and playful, and they can't wait to get their socks off. There's just socks went flying all over the place before I was teaching them. Ask a 13-year-old to take their socks off. Nope, they won't take their socks off. They won't take their socks off. And also, I found that it was the 13 and 14-year-olds that I was teaching I found the most rewarding, especially for the boys who at that age they become very disconnected in a way from their bodies, because they become much more critical of them. They feel they're too fat, too thin, not strong enough. They become more influenced by what their peers say than what their parents say. Usually, if they're very sport orientated or drama. Actually, drama is very interesting, the relationship with drama and adolescence ages, because drama is very much if you're an actor, I work with actors, you have to breathe properly. You have to breathe from the belly in order to project rather than to shout. And you have to relax. You have to push your shoulders down. Rather, you can tell if someone's nervous or breathing from the throat because their voice is very thin and very metallic. And so those who practice drama at GCSE level or A level, they tend to have, or do some sort of amateur dramatics, they tend to be much more relaxed. And it's interesting how many drama schools now have regular yoga practice because they realize how important that is. Also helps with memorizing lines as well. It's sort of like memory, it's very, very good. But I also found that it helped them realize, a lot of the teenagers at that age are quite angry, quite frustrated, and it's really good for releasing anger. There's certain sorts of breath or breathing exercises that you can do that are really good for releasing anger, releasing grief, really identifying, especially coming up to exams. So there's yoga for exam stress, and I make it very relevant. Very relevant to them there. And I've been teaching them now, that particular demographic, for over a decade now. And I've seen how through, the impact that COVID and lockdown had on that particular generation, how it affected their breath, everyone's breath, but their breath became very shallow because we had a mask over our mouths all the time. How you weren't able to connect, they weren't able to connect with the people, just like everybody normally does, and that has an impact on the body as well. How they became more rigid, less flexible. So I do a lot with the 12, 13-year-olds on flexibility, improving, stretching. Even sports people don't stretch enough. And so I do a lot of stretching, but I make it fun and I make it relevant and I make it funny. And it has to be, if it's fun and relevant and funny, because there's a lot of, especially at that year group, they're just about to decide what they're doing, what subjects they're doing. And some of the subjects that they are told, they've got to do a science or they've got to do a language. They may think, I'm never going to use French in my life. I'm never going to use chemistry in my life. But I always tell them, this you will need, this you will use. And the interesting thing is, when I teach adults now, they wish they'd been taught yoga at schools as a teenager. They wish actually they had chosen careers where they had been more passionate about things. They wish they'd been more playful. They'd wish they'd chosen something that wasn't so financially, the financial metric wasn't so that wasn't what they were after. But it just becomes, paying the mortgage, etc., things like that. So
yeah. And just to wrap up, because we've only got 5 minutes left, it's just flown by with you. What do you think is the greatest challenge affecting young people today, and how can we better support them?
Mentioned about curiosity. I think anything which helps to trigger their curiosity is a really good thing. I'm campaigning to get thinking classes back into schools. I do lateral thinking workshops and assemblies in schools, and I'm open to doing that more with schools if anyone is interested, and that goes down really, really well. And as far as the other thing is concerned, joy. I think they need, it sounds awful, but they need more joy in their life. I think that is a really important thing. So identifying the value of play.
Yeah, that's great. And I really hope you get far with the schools in that, because I think that curiosity is so important. And that's one thing that sometimes slightly worries me with AI, is that we're removing that curiosity and that ability to think, to write, to create. And that's why I'm so grateful for your poems and so grateful for all the work you're doing as well with these schools. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and speaking with me today, Sarah, and sharing your art as well.
Lovely. It was my pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you.